Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's program. Tonight we have the Dan Schnur Political Report. The topic tonight will be Israel, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Is there a path forward in the Middle East? For those of you who would like to submit questions, please type them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the page, and Rachel Kenderdine will be managing your questions during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 35 minutes. Hey, Dan, please join us. I know everyone is so eager to get this program started.
Well, thanks very much, Kim. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Every month, it seems like we have far too much to talk about than we have time for over the course of just 1 hour. And given everything that's going on in the Middle East right now, this week's conversation is going to be even more of a challenge because there's an awful lot going on in this part of the world right now, even more than we might have anticipated a month ago when we set this subject. But we'll do our best to cover as much of it as possible in the next 30 minutes or so. And then at the bottom of the hour, of course, transition to what's always my favorite part of the program, when as many of you as possible have a chance to weigh in with your questions and insights. So we're going to spend, particularly given the events of the last few weeks in Israel, we're going to spend most of our time early on discussing that country. But even the conversation about Israel is going to be much different than it would have been in prior years, or even a few months ago, given the tremendous political dispute that's going on in that country right now. Then, of course, we have the Palestinian conflict, we have the Iran nuclear challenge, we have the changing role of Saudi Arabia, and much, much more. And so let's start, and I'm going to ask Katie to help me out with this. Let's start with a question on which topic in this very volatile, very critically important region you think is the most important. So which of these topics, and they're all of critical import, not just in the region, but globally, but which of these 5 challenges do you think is the most important? Is it Iran's growing nuclear capability? Is it the Israel-Palestinian conflict? Is it, as I referred to a moment ago, the current debate within Israel, the internal debate over Israel's judicial reform in its courts? Is it the increasingly complicated challenge posed by Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, not just on oil and energy issues, but on a whole range of other fronts as well? And finally, we're seeing renewed assertiveness on the part of Russia and an unprecedented level of engagement from China in the Middle East. Should that be the greatest challenge that we talk about? Well, Katie, what does our group have to say? I don't know if it's fair to ask them to pick out one, but they managed to. How about that? 30%, almost a third of you, said that Russia and China's role is the most important challenge to be faced here. And taking the global view, I think that's a really smart analysis. But it's worth noting that the internal debate within Israel over the court overhaul and judicial reform got almost as much support, 26%. And so I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll start with internal Israeli politics and then work our way around and then wind up by talking about the Middle East's role in global geopolitics as it relates to Russia and, even more importantly, in my opinion, to China's role. But let's start, as I said earlier, let's start with what may be the most serious domestic political divide in Israel's history. Now, of course, the state of Israel is no stranger to controversy, but most of that controversy, most of those most severe disagreements have been external conflicts with the Palestinians, before that, and any number of other wars with the country's Arab neighbors. But this one's different. And even though Israeli domestic politics has never been particularly harmonious, I don't know that we've ever seen such an acrimonious and such an angry debate as this one on the question of how to reform the nation's court system. Now, before we dig into this deeper, I think it's important to note that a judicial overhaul has been supported in the past by both the Israeli left and right. But now it's turned into a very ugly partisan battle, being fueled primarily by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his most conservative allies as part of the coalition that brought him back into office last year. Now let's take a little bit of historical perspective on this as it relates to Netanyahu himself. Benjamin Netanyahu, or Bibi as he's known, Netanyahu has been either Israel's prime minister or the leader of the opposition for almost exactly 1/3 of the country's entire modern day existence. The state of Israel is 75 years old this year, and for roughly 25 years, Netanyahu has either been prime minister or the leader of the opposition. That's extraordinary. And if Netanyahu, to put this in perspective, if he were to complete his current term in office, he will have served as prime minister for longer than David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir combined. So we've been watching Bibi Netanyahu for a while, and by now we've got a pretty good sense of what motivates him. And for most of his career, since the 1990s, when he emerged on the national and international stage, Netanyahu has always had three overriding policy issues as it relates to his own political career and his work for the state of Israel. And those are security and safety issues, which is probably his strongest political suit over the years, economic growth policy, and then finally expanding Israel's presence on the world stage. And all three of those have been consistent priorities for him, whether you happen to agree with the Netanyahu agenda or not, since the very beginning. But up until now, the idea of judicial reform was rarely evident in either his public pronouncements or in his private deal-making. This is just not something he's talked about before, at least not very much. But Netanyahu's recent embrace of a court overhaul is clearly now threatening the progress he's achieved on all three of these fronts over the years: safety and security, economic growth, and global relations. The domestic turmoil that's taking place is causing technology leaders and other international investors to reconsider the risk of committing their capital to Israel. The anti-Iran coalition, which we'll talk more about later, that Netanyahu has been working to forge for so long, may be fracturing because of this internal discord. And most notably, and most politically damaging to Netanyahu, is the safety and security of Israeli Jews, which has always been his strongest political asset, is now being challenged on multiple fronts, almost all caused by the debate over the court overhaul. Over the course of his career, Netanyahu's most significant electoral successes have always come on the heels of very pronounced outbreaks of violence that then caused Israeli voters to turn to Netanyahu and his Likud party to protect them against even higher levels of terrorism and bloodshed and death than they face under more normal circumstances. Netanyahu's first election as prime minister came on the heels of a series of suicide bombings way back in the 1990s that Shimon Peres, who was the prime minister at that point, wasn't able to stop. Then when Netanyahu came back into office in 2009, it was right after a very, very ill-fated Israel-Hamas ceasefire had exploded into open warfare between Israel and Gaza. And of course, Netanyahu's most recent victory last year occurred immediately after the outbreak of violence in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem. So simply put, when Israelis are feeling endangered, they turn to Netanyahu. And that's always, like I said, it's always been his strongest political suit. But now Netanyahu is being viewed differently by many Israelis. And more Israeli voters are seeing Netanyahu as a contributor to the security threats that Israel faces, rather than their protector from those threats. And in prior years, a terrorist outbreak in Tel Aviv, renewed fighting on the Temple Mount, and attacks from Lebanon and Syria, all of which we've seen in the last several days, would have reminded Israeli voters why they'd always backed Netanyahu 'Under these circumstances. But Netanyahu's firing and then reversal of the firing of his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, recently came about after his own defense minister, his own appointee, raised questions about Israel's military preparedness. Because, as the defense minister said, so many military reservists in Israel, and remember, there's universal military service required of almost all Israelis. This defense minister warned that there were so many military reservists refusing to report for duty because of their protesting this judicial debate. Gallant, argued that this could endanger national security. As a result, Netanyahu fired him, and just in the last couple of days has reversed that firing. But that whole debate has made Israelis question, for the first time ever, whether or not Netanyahu is the leader best positioned to protect them from violence and from terrorism. Now, Netanyahu's interest in a judicial overhaul, which, as I said before, he's never really talked about in years past, at least not publicly, has clearly been driven by his most conservative allies as part of his coalition, the ultra-conservative and ultra-religious parties that give him a working majority in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. And for years, those communities have been very angry at the actions that the courts have taken, both to restrict Israeli military action in the West Bank, and also the courts pushback against greater autonomy for Israel's Haredi and other most religious residents. So what you've got here are two priorities for conservatives in Israel. One, security issues in the West Bank. The second, issues relating to the ultra-religious Israelis. In both of those areas, the Knesset, the voters' elected representatives, have moved in a more conservative direction, while the courts pushed back on both. Not a surprise, if you think about it, that the most conservative legislators in Israel were itching to rein in the courts. But that's never been a real priority for Netanyahu before. Like I said, he's always been about security, he's been about the economy, he's been about global relationships. But now, of course, Bibi has another goal, and likely an even more important one, and that's his own survival. Because, as all of you know, Netanyahu has been facing a series of legal challenges that could potentially remove him from the prime minister's office. And Netanyahu has been trying to pass legislation through the Knesset that would make it much more difficult to remove him. The centrists, or at least the center-right members of the Knesset, who've been supporters of Likud and of Netanyahu in the past, they were very upset by this. They refused to support Netanyahu as long as he was trying to avoid these legal proceedings. So what that left Netanyahu with was only one option. Instead of the center-right coalition, which he's relied on in the past, he had to rely on a much more conservative coalition, and they're the ones who are pushing this judicial reform. Now, my own feeling is that Netanyahu doesn't care all that much about judicial reform, and he's going to use it as a bargaining chip to try to pass legislation that would make it more difficult to remove him from office. And so I don't think these reforms are going to take place. But in the meantime, they are roiling Israeli society and Israeli politics, and as a result, putting Israel at some considerable international security risk. So that we can talk much more about this in the second half an hour if you like, because these are incredibly complicated issues. And as you can tell, I've struggled a little bit to try to talk about them in a relatively short period of time, but we can come back to them if you like. But let's, for right now at least, let's set aside domestic politics in Israel. And as I said a moment ago, this controversy has affected many of the country's international goals too. And so what I want to do in just a moment is move on to the Palestinian conflict, which also has elevated in recent weeks. But before we move into that discussion in great detail, I have a series of questions I'd like to ask you. And Katie, if you can help me with these, we're going to run through all three of these pretty quickly. But I'd love to get you as our groups, broader thoughts on these questions. So Katie, can we put up the second one? There we go. Fairly straightforward. Do you consider yourself a supporter of Israel? Yes, a strong supporter. Yes, but not extremely committed. And third, maybe you consider yourself more neutral on this question now. Third, you consider yourself an opponent of Israel, but only mild, not something you feel very strongly about. Or fifth and finally, you would consider yourself strongly opposed to direction in which the state of Israel is currently headed. Let's see how we did on that one, Katie, can we? Very interesting results and a little bit surprising. 75%, 3/4 of you consider yourself to be supporters of Israel. 17% say neutral and 8% consider yourselves opponents. And although we're not going to have the chance today, I'm going to make a very strong supposition that had we asked the same question a year or 2 or 5 ago, those first two categories, strong supporter and supporter but less committed, would have been even larger. And my guess is that those numbers have diminished given the controversies over the last few years. But 75%, let's start with this, consider yourself to be supporters at some level of Israel, and then another quarter either neutral or opposed. So let's keep going. Katie, can we go to the next question? Now, very similar question, just on the opposite side. Do you consider yourself to be a supporter of the Palestinians? And of course, these don't need to be mutually exclusive. You can be supporters of both or opponents of both, but we'd be interested in hearing your opinion. So same series of options as you saw for the previous question. Number one, you consider yourself to be a strong supporter of the Palestinian cause. Second, do you feel like you're a supporter, but not particularly ardent in that support? Third, more neutral. Fourth, do you consider yourself an opponent, but a fairly mild one for the Palestinians? Or five, do you consider yourself to be a strong opponent to the Palestinian presence? And Katie, when you have it ready, let's see what that one shows too. Okay. Well, this is really interesting too. 49%, just a little bit less than half, consider yourselves supporters of the Palestinians, which means, I'm guessing, that we've got, if not a majority, a pretty large plurality of group members who consider themselves supporters of both the Israelis and the Palestinians. Certainly a much higher neutral number here, 31%, more than double those of you who said that you were neutral on Israel, and then 21% that consider yourselves to be opponents to the Palestinians. So very strong support for Israel, medium level support for the Palestinians. And now we're going to put you in a tougher position with our next question, Katie, if we can. We're going to ask you to choose. If you had to choose, which side do you support more? And this is primarily a question for those of you who said you supported both. But even if not, I'd like to hear your answers on this. Do you consider your support stronger for Israel from the Palestinians? Second, conversely, for the Palestinians more than Israel? Third, do you consider your support for the two of them roughly equal? And fourth, do you not support either one of them? Katie, what do we got for this? Look at that. 57% say Israel, 12% say the Palestinians. And if you look at it, that's almost a 5-to-1 margin in Israel's favor, which I will tell you is a much stronger leaning than we now see among American voters overall. 27% say both equally, and I suspect that number has risen in recent years. And 5% of you clearly have no use for either. So now one of the results of the political fight, and I alluded to this briefly earlier, one of the results of the political fight over the courts is that Israel's various enemies in the region have sensed an opportunity. And their thought, and this goes back to the defense minister's point, their thought is that if Israel's government is distracted, if the government's divided, and if many military reservists, if large numbers of reservists are not reporting for duty out of protest, Israel's adversaries are thinking this could provide for them an opportunity that otherwise wouldn't exist. Because normally when Israel comes under attack, whether from terrorism or for another type of external threat, the country and the government tend to come together. But given the ferocity of the disagreement over this judicial overhaul, that's not happening here. and Israel's foes are seeing an opportunity. And as a result, we've seen increased violence in the West Bank and in Gaza. We've seen a conflict on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, to the point where the Israeli government announced just today that Jews would not be allowed to visit the Temple Mount for the last 2 weeks of Ramadan in order to avoid further violence. We've seen terrorist attacks in Tel Aviv, and for the first time in many years, we're seeing missile attacks from Lebanon and Syria on borders that have been largely quiet for quite some time now. And all of those, I believe, have come up as a result of the sense of potential vulnerability that Israel's detractors see as a result of this current domestic political crisis. Now, back to Israel and the Palestinians, there's been no serious effort toward achieving peace between Israel and the Palestinians for many years, either between the two rivals themselves or externally by the US or any other foreign presence. Instead, in recent years in particular, the focus, both within the region and more broadly on a global basis, the focus has been on strengthening Israel's relationship with other countries in the region. And that's not because these other countries like Israel anymore, but because they, like Israel, see a growing nuclear threat posed by Iran. And so what Israel's been able to do in forging these relationships is to be able to work together on economic, on cultural, on tourism, and even to some degree on military issues with countries that would not have worked with them before. The establishment of the treaty known as the Abraham Accords between Israel and 4 Gulf states was the first important step in this direction. And more recently, Saudi Arabia has sent signals about the possibility of joining as well. They've worked with Israel more informally in the past, but we're letting it be known late last year that they might be willing to consider joining the Abraham Accords and therefore forming an even more formal and therefore stronger bulwark against Iran. But once again, as a result of the domestic political dispute over the court overhaul inside of Israel, that potential for Saudi Arabia looks much less than it did even 3-4 months ago. Now, Saudi Arabia, and many of you mentioned the Saudis as a challenge in the Middle East. The Saudis have always presented a very complicated challenge for the United States ever since Franklin Roosevelt visited that country during his presidency. On one hand, Saudi Arabia and its closest allies are extremely valuable sources of oil and energy. And more recently, as I mentioned a moment ago, they've been an equally valuable ally in pushing back against Iran. On the other hand, the Saudis have a very, very controversial and somewhat unattractive history on human rights issues. And if you remember, that's what created such problems for Joe Biden when he took his trip to the Middle East last year. He'd made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with Saudi Arabia's current leadership, but his advisors prevailed upon him, given the war in Ukraine and the potential oil crunch that would have been caused by Russia's, the lack of availability from Russia's oil and energy resources. Biden was pressured by his advisors to go to Saudi Arabia and try to make nice, and it was not a successful trip, either substantively or politically. And of course, and since then, the Saudis have led a broader effort to reduce oil production from OPEC. And of course, cutting oil production means more demand, which means higher prices, which means what we're seeing now from Saudi Arabia and some of the other OPEC countries is an effort to create political challenges at home for Biden, because higher energy prices, of course, is something that the American public doesn't like very much. Now, to be fair, there's other reasons that OPEC would raise oil prices, and we can talk more about that in a few minutes if you like. But just to put this relationship in some context, on one hand, the US and Saudi Arabia have always worked together because of oil and energy resources and because of the common challenge of Iran. On the other hand, the problems that Saudi Arabia has had on human rights and now its movement to cut oil supply create real problems for the United States. So once more, I'd like to ask you a question. We didn't spend nearly as much time on this as I would have liked, but like I said, we got a lot of things to cover in this part of the world. So Katie, if we can put up the fifth question, now that we've talked about Saudi Arabia, maybe not enough, but a little bit. How do you feel about Saudi Arabia's role in the Middle East? Generally, do you feel very positive that they're a force for good, either because of the value they provide in terms of oil, the relationship and the alliance and support for confronting Iran, or for other reasons? You feel very positive about Saudi Arabia. Second, you feel very negative about Saudi Arabia, either because of its human rights record or its more recent actions on oil supply, or for other reasons. Both, they're very positive. You feel very positive and very negative, given that wide range of factors, or neither. You don't really have much of a strong opinion about this country at all. Okay, Katie, let's see this answer if we can, when you have a chance. Look at how split our group is. Well, actually, let me reread those answers. Look at how not split our group is. Sorry, 5%, only 5% of our group see Saudi Arabia as a force for good. 46%, almost half, have very negative feelings. And then 48% come down somewhere in between, either with conflicted feelings about Saudi Arabia, or not very strong feelings. But on that very positive versus very negative, that's a 9-to-1 imbalance. And that should tell you right here, that should tell you right now, that the very practical value that Saudi Arabia can provide on energy and Iran, those are strong enough factors to outweigh a very decided tilt in terms of public and political opinion. And while there are some members of Congress who've been urging Biden and Trump before him to cut ties with Saudi Arabia, neither administration, nor have any of their predecessors, going all the way back to Roosevelt, ever seriously considered cutting those ties because of the positive ramifications of the relationship. And so now, of course, it's getting even more complicated in this part of the world, and particularly with Saudi Arabia and Iran, because, as I know most of you have read in recent weeks, China has asserted itself as a key player in the region, and announcing an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran to begin the process of restoring diplomatic relations. And at the very beginning of tonight's program, you mentioned Russia and China's role in the Middle East of being of particular concern to you. And in addition to Russia's relationship in Syria, and now what we've learned just in the last day or so, Russia's relationships in Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. But China, coming to this region really for the first time, unsettles an already very unsettled region in a very, very significant way. So with China announcing this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, we learn a few things. One, we know that the Saudis and the Iranians have been talking for some time now, and China just sort of came in at the end. And there's some dispute as to how much of a role the Chinese actually played in brokering the agreement. But more important to me than how much work China did or did not do on this is the fact that they felt compelled to take so much public global credit for this. And while this process still has a long way to go, it points very strongly to China's interest in asserting itself as a global peacemaker, much as they've been recently attempting to do in the war between Ukraine and Russia. And what I will say is that, simply put, the Chinese era of Middle Eastern geopolitics has begun. The Chinese leadership sees their country as an emerging global leader on a par with the United States or greater. And in addition to their work in Russia and Ukraine, in addition to their extensive economic involvement in Latin America and Africa and throughout the Southern Hemisphere, taking on a role in the Middle East shows a much more assertive role for the Chinese than we've ever seen before. And before we go to your questions, I just want to take a minute or two and talk about this and why it's so important historically. Because over the course of Israel's 75 years of existence, the world has seen two very distinct eras of global superpower involvement. So for roughly Israel's first 40 years of existence, from 1948 until the late 1990s, the Middle East was viewed by both the US and the Soviet Union as one of their many staging grounds for Cold War confrontations. The Soviets, and most people don't remember this, originally supported Israel's independence way back in the 1940s. And that was based on the belief that if Israel established itself as a socialist state in such an important part of the world, that could be a really valuable asset for the Soviets. But it didn't take long, as you all know, for the USSR to switch sides. And they became a strong supporter of Israel's Arab foes throughout most of the second half of the 20th century. And ultimately, the United States, of course, emerged as Israel's strongest diplomatic and military ally for many decades. So then, the Berlin Wall falls in 1989. And at that point, there's only one global superpower. And for the next 30 plus years, where the United States was the only superpower in the world, we tried periodically to engage in the Middle East, but were never able to gain sufficient credibility in the Arab world to act as an effective convening influence, as an effective, credible broker. And so while there wasn't another country of similar size and strength to serve as a counterpart to the US in the Middle East, there hasn't been a lot of progress toward peace in those years. But now we're at a different place. We're in an era of global power politics where China has emerged as a counterbalance to the Western alliance, as we're seeing on many fronts around the world. And what that means is that President Xi's goal is to show up the United States, to demonstrate to a global audience that China can be a more effective world leader than the US. But as it relates to the Middle East, Beijing doesn't seem to be looking for a confrontational role against the US and Israel the way the USSR did. In fact, Biden and Trump's administrations have both issued warnings to Israel about getting too close to China. So if you think about it, the last time there were two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, they used the Middle East as a battleground. Now, with two superpowers, the United States and this time China, both have vested interests in the Middle East, both have very different interests there, but there's much more overlap. Neither one of them is looking to be an antagonist, at least not in a military sense. And so the possibility that two superpowers in the Middle East, for the first time in Israel's history, both see the potential benefits for their own countries for progress, that's something that's really unique. So on one hand, China does have the ability to help Middle East move in a more productive direction, taking on roles that the United States and before the US, the Soviet Union could not or would not take on. And again, as I said, it's the first time in modern history that both global superpowers have both been invested in improving the situation on the ground in this region. On the flip side, of course, is that better relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia create all sorts of additional challenges for the United States, and almost certainly create additional potential danger for Israel, as both the US and Israel's relationships with Saudi Arabia almost definitionally suffer as the Saudis' relationship with Iran improves. And then, of course, and this is going to be a conversation for another webinar, if China is able to assert itself as a credible and respected player in yet another part of the world, that is something that could be create a very complicated set of challenges for the United States. So last question from me, and then we'll go to your questions, is what do you think, and if we can put this one up, Katie, do you think that China's growing role in the Middle East is a good or a bad thing? Either it's a very good thing, that the fact that you have two superpowers potentially working in the same direction could lead to breakthroughs breakthroughs there that have never happened before. You think, on balance, it's a slightly positive, but not a major one. Third, is it neutral? Fourth option, is it slightly negative? China's larger role in the region and an improved Iran-Saudi Arabia relationship isn't a great thing, but it's not a horrible thing? Or fifth and finally, do you see this trend as a very negative one, either because of China's emerging role or the changing relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or both? And so, Katie, how did we do in answer to this last question? Only 4% of you see it as something that's very good. 22%, so combined, roughly a quarter of our group sees these changes in the Middle East as being a positive thing. 17% are neutral, but look at that, 57%, a very strong majority, see this as something is a bad thing, not a good thing, and 28% of you see it as something very negative. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to thank Katie for all of her help, and I'm going to ask Rachel if she can join us, and then we can move on to your questions and hopefully go through the rest of the hour together, covering as much ground as we possibly can.
Yes. Hi, Dan. We have so many great questions this evening, so I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But the first one, so we've gotten a lot of comments in the Q&A box from audience members about supporting the people of Israel versus the current leadership. So this person asked, do you think that all of the political parties in Israel could come together and oppose Netanyahu, like what's occurring in Turkey in the effort to defeat President Erdogan?
Well, it's a very good question. And in fact, there's recent polling that's come out of Israel just in the last several days that show that Netanyahu and his Likud party are actually running third in public opinion polls. And that Benny Gantz and his more centrist party right now have a pretty considerable lead should an election take place. Now, there's no indication that an election is about to take place, but if the current situation does not change, then I think there's very much a potential for a coalition to emerge with some of Netanyahu's former allies, people who support him on economic, on security, and on global issues, lining up against him as they did in 2021 and 2022 to elect a coalition government, simply to put a stop to this judicial reform and to remove the possibility of Netanyahu gaining sufficient protections to stay in office. So no guarantee at all, but if the current situation continues, it's certainly looking increasingly likely.
Staying with Israel, do you think creating a constitution for Israel would potentially put the issue of the court to bed?
Well, it would certainly help. That's a really smart question. For those of you who don't follow this quite as obsessively as the questioner and I do, if you're not aware, the state of Israel does not have a constitution. And from what I've read, this goes back to David Ben-Gurion, Israel's very first prime minister, who felt that he commanded such a strong domestic political majority that he felt that the country didn't need one. He wasn't opposed to it, just never made much of an effort to institute one. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that Israel, unlike the United States, which has three branches of government, an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch, Israel, like most parliamentary democracies, only has two branches of government, a legislative branch, the Knesset, which elects a prime minister as the leader of the majority party, and the courts. And one of the reasons there's been such debate in the past about the need for judicial reforms, both from the right and the left, is many people concerned that if the courts can overrule the legislative branch, the Knesset, then that creates an imbalance of powers. Now, those on the political left and even political center who might have wanted to see something like this happen in the past are very suspicious of a much, much more aggressive effort toward court overhaul from ultra-conservatives. But no question, to the questioner's point, no doubt whatsoever, if that Israel had a constitution to create some type of separation of powers and balance of powers, such as the type we see in this country, would not automatically resolve the current court debate, but would make it much, much easier to resolve.
So switching gears, we've had a ton of questions come in about the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal. So this audience member asserted the most dangerous development is actually the diminishing credibility of the US in the region, allowing China and Russia to become brokers among Middle Eastern countries. Was the US caught off guard by the Chinese role in this agreement? And what do you believe is the reason for this nadir for the US, and can it be rehabilitated? Sorry, that was several at once, but
No, but all good questions. And for some years now, the United States has been talking about a quote unquote pivot to the Pacific Rim as China has emerged as a more assertive regional and global power. Each of the last three presidents at different times have talked about refocusing a lot of the US military and diplomatic attention from other parts of the world to Asia. And not surprisingly, when Middle Eastern countries hear that the United States is developing another priority, they get nervous. And it shouldn't be surprising that if they don't think that the US is going to be playing as much of a role in the Middle East, they feel the need, whether Israel, whether Saudi Arabia, or any other countries, to look for other potential allies. So I certainly wouldn't argue that the challenges in the Pacific Rim are not considerable, but to a large degree, the last few presidents in different ways have all unintentionally made it clear to the Middle East that we don't care as much about them anymore. And whether it's the shift on the focus to China or a lesser direct involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it's added up to leave an impression among Middle Eastern nations that they need to find some other friends. So in answer to the other question, it's pretty clear to me that the United States was very surprised by China's role in the Iran-Saudi Arabia agreement. And you can tell by how quickly US spokespersons denigrated the Chinese role. They said, oh, they didn't really do that. That's something that other countries have worked on with Iran and Saudi Arabia for many years. All China did was come in at the end. And that kind of response suggests to me that they weren't really prepared for that type of elevated China presence in the region. And so to a large degree, even though the Middle East is exceptionally volatile compared to other corners of the planet, now the US challenge in the Middle East is very similar to where it is in many other parts of the world, where China's invested a great amount of time and energy and often money over the years to build relationships. And the US simply just hasn't been as engaged. We've seen the Biden administration trying to take steps in this regard in Africa. Jill Biden, the First Lady, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Vice President Kamala Harris have all gone to Africa in the last several months, and Biden himself is going later this year. And so pronounced has been Chinese involvement in that continent that when all of these US representatives go to Africa, one of the first things they do is make it clear that they're there because they want to help Africa, not just to push back against China. And that relationship, and that message is received with varying degrees of credibility, I will say. I'll say publicly, there's been recent global polling in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Latin America that shows increased doubts about the strength of the US's international commitments. And so, as I said, this is just one more part of the world where China sees an ability to assert themselves in a way that the US either can't or won't match.
So this audience member asks, what impact does the Iran-Saudi Arabia rapprochement have on Israel's position in the Middle East?
Boy, it's not only a good question, it's a difficult one, because the honest answer is we don't know. The initial reaction I've seen from most quarters, and it was my initial reaction as well, is that this can't be good for Israel. That if the primary motivation for the Abraham Accords and for stronger unofficial and informal ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia have been a joint or distrust toward Iran and a need to work together. Simply put, a lot of these countries decided that they feared Iran more than they disliked Israel, driving these relationships together. And so the natural and understandable initial reaction is, if Saudi Arabia isn't as scared of Iran anymore, or I should say, to be fair, isn't as worried about Iran's nuclear capacity as they were before, then it's going to be much less likely for their relationship with either Israel or the United States to continue at the present level or to improve. And so my instinct is that that's the most likely outcome, is that it's not good for either the US role in the region or for Israel's safety. But that said, I think it's also worth noting that the agreement that Saudi Arabia and Iran signed is the first step in a really long process. The Iranians don't have a particularly strong history as credible negotiators. There's a lot of wariness, not just within Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere, that Iran is not going to follow through on its commitments and that this whole thing is going to break apart. And in that regard, I know we didn't talk about it much at all today, but to see whether this relationship is actually progressing or not, keep an eye on Yemen, because in addition to Iran's nuclear capacity, that's been the real flashpoint between those two countries. Iran and Saudi Arabia funding opposite sides of a really ugly and bloody civil war there for many years. If the Iranian-backed forces were to step back and become less aggressive toward the Saudi presence there, then that means the relationship really is progressing, which is good for Yemen because it means less violence and less death, but it does bode more poorly for Israel and the US's long-term prospects in the region. If the violence in Yemen does resurge as time passes, then of course that's bad for the people of Yemen. This war is always bad for the most directly affected people, but that means that the relationship isn't strengthening, and perhaps that original agreement is not going to lead to stronger ties. The one other point I'd make, just for those who, like me, initially thought this is really, really bad for Israel and for the US, it's worth noting that Saudi Arabia and Iran had diplomatic relations for many, many years. And in fact, it was only in 2016, after some terrorist activity, that the relationship broke off. So for the last 7 years, they have not had diplomatic relations. But for years and years and years before that dissolution in 2016, it's not as if they were working hand in glove and were best friends. So if this is a return to a very tenuous status quo, as opposed to a step up toward a genuinely peaceful partnership, then it's probably not as dangerous for Israel or as challenging for the US as our original instincts might think. In other words, they've been here before, and these two countries have never gotten along all that well. And that's for reasons that long predate Israel, that long predate the modern world, and go back not just decades, but centuries. And that is definitely a conversation for another day.
So something that you mentioned, piggybacking off something that you mentioned at the beginning of your answer to the last question, with Russia and Syria and China's involvement with Saudi Arabia and Iran, can the US and Israel do anything about Iran's nuclear program?
Well, at this point, it's become more and more clear that there is very little that the United States and its allies can do to restrain Iran's nuclear activity. And what that means is that it becomes more and more likely that Israel resorts to some type of military means to keep Iran from progressing even further. But this gets back to the discussion we were having earlier at the end of the first half hour about geopolitics, and particularly about China's role in the region. One of the things we talked about last month, if you remember, Rachel, of course you do, is we talked about how China's relationship with Russia may have played a contributing factor in Russia's decision, at least to date, not to use tactical nuclear or biological weapons. In other words, Xi was able to talk to Putin in a way that neither Biden or other Western leaders could, to tell him to avoid that option. If China is playing a more assertive role in the Middle East, it's entirely possible that they could be able to have conversations with Iran that we, the United States and the West, can't. And even though China would do it, at least in part, to look good at the expense of the United States, I think you'd agree that if they were able to use that newfound credibility and leverage to convince Iran not to complete work toward a nuclear weapon, then having an assertive China in the Middle East might not be a completely bad thing altogether. Now, I'll admit that's the most optimistic possible view on a very complicated situation. It's worth noting that China buys immense amounts of Iranian oil. And as the rest of the world has imposed increasingly severe sanctions on Iran, Iran has become more and more dependent on China. And of course, as we've seen now, their relationship with Russia is getting stronger and stronger. But best possible outcome here is China, having brokered an agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, might be in a better position than anyone else to now convince Iran not to continue its march toward nuclear capability.
Very interesting. So continuing on the energy vein, what impact does the Biden administration's view on the development of Saudi uranium and nuclear energy have for Middle East geopolitics?
I have to admit, I don't know the answer to that. The Biden administration has been very circumspect on this one. Frankly, they've sent out conflicting signals. And this is where not just the US, but a lot of global priorities begin to compete against each other. On one hand, the United States really likes the idea of the Middle East moving away from such a strong dependency on fossil fuels. And we're seeing any number of Gulf states, not just Saudi Arabia, but plenty of others, now looking to move aggressively into alternative energies or alternative energy sources. So on one hand, there's a real incentive there, given the Biden administration's climate change agenda. On the other hand, the Biden administration is also very realistic. And the president and his representatives have said several times that while they ultimately want to move to a carbon-free future, that's not coming in the immediate, which means there's going to be several years between now and that carbon-free existence when the US and the Western world really does need oil and more traditional energy sources. So on one hand, the idea of Middle Eastern energy sources moving toward more environmentally sensitive fuels can be a benefit. On the other hand, until the world is ready to move completely carbon-free, there's still going to be a great reliance on traditional fossil fuels. And right now, at least, Saudi Arabia and the other OPEC nations know that they can benefit tremendously by continuing to be a source of those more traditional energy sources. So long, winding, rambling answer, and I'll ultimately end up where I started. I don't know, because I've heard different people in the Biden administration saying different things about this. I think John Kerry, the president's climate envoy, and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, don't contradict each other on this thing, but they certainly emphasize different aspects of this. And it's really hard to tell right now what the Biden administration would consider to be the best possible outcome on this question.
So switching gears a bit, but we've gotten several questions in this vein, so I want to make sure to get to it. Do you see the internal dissension in the USA as a primary factor in the rise of China as a or the primary superpower in the world?
Okay. Interesting question, because we talked about internal domestic politics in Israel, what that's done for their standing internationally. Now a really interesting question about what internal domestic political disputes here do for our world standing. I guess I'd offer a couple of thoughts. A lot of countries, particularly the Western European democracies, and particularly a lot of the Pacific Rim countries other than China, felt that Donald Trump's administration did not give them the consideration they needed, and were very, very enthused when Biden replaced him in office. But the more internal political divisions they see here, the more it concerns them that Trump or someone like Trump could return to office, and that would set them back into a more fraught international era, such as the type they felt they were dealing with between 2016 or between 2017 and 2021. But even more broadly, and this may have been the premise of the question, is does the distraction caused by domestic political divisions prevent our country from focusing on our international goals? I think the answer to that is yes. There's no question that a president or a Congress that is divided can't move forward as purposefully on any issue as they can when they're going in the same direction. But even more importantly, the international perception is that if the United States is consumed with its own domestic political battles, that it's not paying as much attention to the rest of the world. Whether that's factually true or not, it's what increasingly the rest of the world is thinking. And so the question is a very smart one, and I'd have to agree with the premise of it.
So bringing it back to Israel for our last question, irrespective of Israel's internal problems, do you believe the Palestinian-Israeli conflict will ever be solved?
I do believe it'll be solved. And I do believe that even though it's much less popular now than in the past, I think it's going to require a two-state solution. There is going to need to be an independent Palestinian state. And while it's not going to be as large as the Palestinians and their strongest advocates would like it to be, I think out of necessity for both the Palestinians and for the Israeli people, there need to be separate states. That said, that's an incredibly unpopular position right now. And nowhere is it more unpopular than in Israel, because such as the animosity has grown to such an extent in recent years that more and more Israelis simply don't see that as a possible answer. But it's worth remembering that probably the most military-minded Israeli leader in the nation's history, Ariel Sharon, ultimately late in his career, reluctantly concluded that a two-state solution would be necessary. And as Sharon himself said, as long as there is only one Israeli state, as long as there's only one country in this region, Israel will ultimately have to choose between being a Jewish state and being a democracy. And I suspect that as time passes, more Israelis will come to that conclusion. It's not going to happen soon. And what it's going to require is not only a restored, but an expanded Abraham Accords. It's going to take Israel's ability to work with Arab countries around the region so that the Palestinian conflict becomes less definitional for the country and for the region. One of the rare things on which Trump and Biden agree on the Middle East or anywhere else is that the best way to solve the Palestinian conflict is to improve Israel's relationship with other Arab nations, which, if you think about it, is the exact reverse of what had been presumed for the first 65 or 70 years of Israel's existence. For decades and decades, American presidents, both Democratic and Republican, have felt we need to solve this conflict before we can create a broader regional approach. Trump and Biden have turned that on its head. And I would say, at least right now, while it's a long path to getting there, it's a more likely path than what U.S. presidents had attempted for many years beforehand. So how's that for a yes, however answer?
It was great. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dan. We had a ton more questions, so we'll have to get to those during continuing the conversation this month.
Excellent. I will look forward to that. And for those who are joining us for our next session, I'll look forward to answering their questions also. But thanks to everybody for being with us tonight. As always, really, really smart questions. And I'm glad we were able to talk about this topic. Rachel, you and I are going to need to huddle later this week to figure out what next month's topic is. But something tells me we're going to have just a harder time fitting it into an hour next month as we did today. So thanks again to everybody.